What's up, everyone? In this video, we're going to go over how to render the SEO information we created in Payload CMS on a Next.js front end. Before we get started, though, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and getting notifications so you never miss when I put out a video about Payload CMS, Next.js, and more. If you'd like to see the code that I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. We're going to be using a Next.js front end to render our SEO content. If you're using a different framework, the rules may be different, but the concepts should be roughly the same. This video also builds on my previous video about setting up Payload CMS's SEO plugin. If you haven't done that yet or you don't know how to, please pause and go watch that video before moving forward. Before we get started with the metadata, let's create a few utilities we'll need to cleanly fetch the data we need. In our project, we'll create a new folder in our source directory called Utilities. In Utilities, we'll create a couple of TypeScript files. The first will be getURL, and the second will be mergeOpenGraph. getURL is going to assist us in getting the URL to be used in our generate metadata function. This is important for when you deploy to something like Vercel and you won't know the URL right away. In getURL, we'll export a new const called getServerSideURL, and we'll assign it an arrow function. Then we need to set a default URL, which we'll set as let URL equal process.env, and we'll use next public server URL. We'll then check to see if there is no URL, but there is a project production URL. So we'll type in if no URL and process.env Vercel project production URL. And if that's true, we'll return our Vercel project production URL. This is where we can set our actual production domain after deploying. If neither of these are true, we'll check if there is no URL at all. And if there's not, we'll set our URL to be our local host, 3000. Then at the very end of this function, we'll just return our URL. Next up, let's create our mergeOpenGraph utility. OpenGraph is what's used to create link previews on social media and messaging apps. What this function will do is it will allow us to first set a default OpenGraph variable for cases where no OpenGraph tags are defined. It will also allow us to override that default with information we create if we choose to. So in our mergeOpenGraph TypeScript file, we'll import type metadata from Next. We'll also need to import our get server-side URL from the utilities that we just created. And we can get started by defining our default OpenGraph with const default OpenGraph. And we'll assign it the metadata type. And we'll open up square brackets next to it and just type in OpenGraph to make sure that the type we want is set. And then we'll set this const to an empty object. We'll start with the type option, which you'll most likely want to set to website. This can be anything as long as it's relevant to your application, but in our case, website is the most relevant. We'll then include a default description, title, and site name, which we'll put blank payload for our title and site name. And for the description, we'll just say this is an extension of the payload blank template. Finally, we'll add a default image by setting the images property, opening a new array, and opening a new object with a single property URL. This property will take the getServerSide URL function and a default file name from our media upload collection that we define. We only have one image to choose from, so I'll pull in that file name here. Once that's done, we can finish our mergeOpenGraph function by exporting a new const called mergeOpenGraph. We'll set it equal to OG short for Open Graph, and a question mark to indicate it's optional, and assign it to the type metadata Open Graph. We'll then assign all of that to the same type metadata Open Graph, and then we can open up our arrow function. You'll then return with the spread operator default Open Graph and OG. These are our default options and any overrides you may have. Lastly, we'll add a separate option, which is images, where you can check if there are any provided images. And if there are, you can return those images. If not, the default images are returned. So we can do this by checking if there are any images on Open Graph. And if there are, we'll use the OG images. And if there's not, we'll use default Open Graph dot images. Our helper functions are now done. So let's get started with generating metadata. We'll create a new TypeScript file in our utilities directory called generate metadata. This is where we're going to write the function we need to render the metadata on our front end. First, we're going to import type metadata from Next, as well as any types for the collections you plan on using for your metadata. So we can import type post from our payload types. You'll also want to pull in your config and media to help us generate our image URL as well. Lastly, we can import our two helper functions and put them to work. So we'll import mergeOpenGraph from our utilities directory, and we'll also import our get server-side URL from our getURL file. Next, you'll define your image URL by setting a new const called get image URL and setting it equal to image with a question mark there, and assign that to the type media config db default ID type and null. This captures all the ways your image URL can be generated while allowing for nothing at all to be returned. Then we can open up an arrow function. Inside the arrow function, you'll set a const to hold your server-side URL. So we'll set constant server URL and set that to get server-side URL. Define a let variable for your URL and set that equal to our server URL. And we're going to concatenate our default file name, which for us is this 2025-01-21 relationship C web P. Then we'll check if there is an image, and the type of this image is equal to object, and that URL is in the image. If all of that is true and you want to include a specific size of image as the OG image URL, you can do that here. If you didn't configure anything in your upload collection's image sizes, then you can just set URL equal to server URL concatenated with image.url. If you did configure an image size you'd like to use for your OG images, you can set a const called OG URL and set it equal to image sizes. And then instead of small here, you might have a different image size name. But regardless, you'll end up returning the URL at the end of it. We can then update our URL assignment below here by checking if there is an OG URL. If there is, we can use the server URL concatenated with our OG URL. And if there's not, we can use our server URL concatenated with our image URL. Then at the end of our getImageURL constant, we can return URL. Now for our final configuration step. Below getImageURL, you'll export a new const called generate meta and set it equal to an async function that takes args doc with partial post and assign the type promise metadata to that function. If you want to include more collections, you can use the union operator to add something like partial and then pages. Since we don't have a pages collection, that's not going to work for us, but you can use any collection that way. So now let's open up an arrow function, deconstruct a new const called doc from args, or an empty object. And now we're using the double vertical pipe with the empty object to ensure that the front end doesn't break if doc is undefined. Next, we need to get our OG image. So let's set a new const called OG image, where we can get image URL and check doc meta.image. We'll then define our const title, where we'll check if doc.meta.title exists, we can return the actual title, and if it doesn't, we can return a default, which we'll set as blank payload. We'll add our checks here to make sure that we get rid of all of our errors. If you'd like to concatenate a default value to the end of your doc meta title, feel free to do that by just adding something like blank payload here. And this can be whatever you want. Lastly, we'll add a new const called description, which will check if there's a doc meta description. And if there is, we'll return the meta description. And if there's not, we'll just return nothing. And so here, we'll add our checks to remove our errors. Now we can return everything. So we'll return an object with title and description, and then we'll define our OpenGraph section. We'll include the OpenGraph property, and then we can bring in our mergeOpenGraph here. We'll then open up the set of curly braces and again include title and description. And now we'll include our images. So we'll check that OG image exists, and if it does, we'll open up a new array with an object with the URL property, which we'll set to OG image. If not, we'll just leave it undefined. We then need to configure our URL. In our example, we created a canonical URL in our SEO plugin configuration. We'll want to use that first before using any kind of fallback. So let's define our URL const and set it equal to doc meta.canonical URL. We'll check that it exists and return it if it does. If it doesn't, we'll then check if the slug we get from the doc is an array. If the slug we get back is an array, that means it's a nested path. So if it is, we'll join our slugs using a / to create a single path. But if not, we'll just use a single / and close our conditional statement there. We can then go into what we're returning for generate meta and include the alternates property, and then canonical, which we can set to URL. In our open graph, we just need to include URL. And I'm missing a couple of commas, but once I do that, all of our errors go away. With all that done, we can now import this function to be used on our front end. We'll go to our page.tsx in our front end folder, and at the top of the file, we'll import our type metadata, and we'll import generate meta from our utilities directory. For our example to work properly, we should create a dynamic route in our posts directory. So in our front end folder, let's create a new posts directory, then a dynamic route called slug, and we'll move our page.tsx into this folder. Next, we should come in here and update our function name to post, set a new type called args to an object of params that takes a promise slug string, and in our post function, we'll add in our params and params promise and set that to the args type. We did all of that so we can receive our page path, so we can see how our generate meta function works across dynamic paths. We'll then destructure a new const called slug. At the top of the function, set it equal to await params promise. Then we change blog1 down here to our slug. Underneath our default function, we'll export an async function called generate metadata. This name is required to be like this by Next.js, so be sure to use this name exactly how it is if you want to generate your metadata. This function will take params as an argument, just like it did above, with the type of args as well, and all of this will be assigned the type promise metadata. In the function, we'll destructure a const called slug, and we'll await our params promise again. And then we need to query our post using the local API to get the current doc. So we'll start by creating a payload object, so const payload equals await get payload, and we'll use the config argument here. Then we'll create a new const called post, which will be set equal to await payload.find. We'll check in our collection posts, limit it to only one document, and use our slug and a where query, where slug equals our slug variable above. For good measure, we can set pagination to false, and then here I'm going to add a then method to process our response to only receive one document. Lastly, we need to return generate meta, where we'll set doc to post. Then with our local host 3000 spun up, we can go to posts.blog1. Once our page is spun up, we can inspect our source, open the head tag, and see all of our metadata here, including our custom canonical field, our title, and our description, as well as any open graph fields that we included. Following these steps will enable you to have a robust and flexible way of generating metadata in your projects that need SEO. In the next video, we'll go over how to generate a sitemap, a robots.txt, and an example of using document data in schema markup. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and getting notifications so you never miss when I post an update about Payload CMS, Next.js, and more. If you have any suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.